Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is the post-race reaction for the Singapore GP race. What was your thoughts on this race? For the general race overall, I thought it was fairly dull, fairly boring race. I mean, the tire strategy didn't really have any effect on this race, and generally there was just a procession of cars going around the track that not even at high speeds. They were going really slow around this, trying to manage those tires so they can keep that one stop so they didn't have to do a two-stop race. And without a whole lot of passing options on this track, it made it rather boring, rather dull. I mean, you had a few things going on here and there. The Red Bulls made it a little bit more exciting, being on that alternate strategy, starting on the hards. So you got some passes going on there initially with them on the hard tires. And then when they switched over to the medium tires, they were coming back through the field on that fresher set. And that made it kind of interesting. And then, of course, the end of the race when the Mercedes dropped off and got onto medium set, trying to push for that front row, made that really an intense battle for that front row position. That kind of just ignited a fire for this race, and it made it most of this race fairly good. Yes, we didn't have a Red Bull on pole. We didn't have a Red Bull on the top three positions. So that was really good to see in the sense that of other people battling it out for that top rung. But overall, in general, if I was going through this race, I mean, you could say it was just, following each other along this race. Now, I really enjoyed this race and I enjoyed this circuit in the past. I love the night race, the lights shine on the cars, and that just the heat and the length of this race makes it really difficult for those cars and the drivers as well, going around and around for 2 hours straight on this circuit. So that puts a lot of heartache and really good endurance that they have to go through to make sure that they finish this race. And we see that with the several DNFs that we've had in this race. So overall, I really enjoyed it. But if you had to rate it, as a race itself, I didn't think it was that very good of a race. So I'd probably give it a 3 out of 10 or a 4 out of 10, because it probably was below average, even though we had that really intense battle at the end for that first position. So as normal, I go through the back of the pack, driver by driver, and go to the front of the pack and just giving my thoughts on each driver as they go through and where they stood. So we will, without further ado, we will start off with Lance Stroll. Lance Stroll did not even start this race. They ended up calling this before the start of the race. He had crashed pretty heavily in that free practice 3 session, and I'm thinking that they didn't have the time or possibly the parts to actually get that Aston Martin back up and operational in time for the start of this race. So he did not start this race, so he started off with only 19 drivers. Yuki Tsunoda ended up having a collision with Perez on that first lap, which knocked him out on that first lap, so we did not get to see him at all. And I would have liked to have seen him and where he would have competed against his teammate Liam Lawson, who did fairly well in this race. But it's kind of hard to gauge, I think, considering we don't have the two teammates battling it out to figure out where they are in comparatively with each other. So far, the AlphaTauri has not been that great this season. I know they had some upgrades for this, and I was, so is that really what Liam Lawson was seeing, or was this just Liam Lawson being that good of a rookie, in his third appearance, getting points? So I'd have liked to have seen a little bit more of Yuki Tsunoda battling out, figuring out how he compared to his new teammate. Hopefully we'll see Liam Lawson next week. But if not, we'll see Daniel Ricciardo, which will be fun too. So we'll have to wait and see for that, what that entails. Then we have Esteban Ocon, who's qualified in 8th. And ended up at 18th. He was doing really good, and he was gotten into that battle of just carrying around behind some cars, with Perez holding up the pack, and was able to get by them, and then he was making his way up to the front, and then he had a gearbox just give out on him. So he ended up having to pull to the side on lap 39 and, lap 44 around turn 2 and just have to pull that Alpine off to the side of the road, which caused a safety car. And I think that was the second safety car, which allowed the Mercedes to actually come in and do some, that switch up with the medium tires that gave a lot of the emphasis for that front of the race. We have Valtteri Bottas, who qualified 16th and ended up in 17th. He ended up having an issue and having to pull off as well. I don't have exactly what happened to him, but I think he ended up having to park his car around turn 14. I think that would have been as part of a little battle that they were having. And then we have George Russell, who is going for that second position of Lando Norris, and just carried it a little bit too far into the corner and caught that edge and ran to the wall pretty heavily, knocking him out at the very last lap, which is a downfall for Russell. And I know he'll be able to bounce back next week, but that really is a heartache for George, as he was really pushing and really wanted that first position, and he thought he could probably have made it if he could have gotten by Lando Norris. He could, with those tires, degrading in them on those new mediums. So it's a shame to see that George hit the wall, but that did cause a lot of that part of that tension go away, in the sense that his teammate Lewis Hamilton, was right behind him, but was not able to, really put pressure on Lando at that point in the race. I didn't have that time to really put pressure after his teammate George ran into the wall. Fernando had a horrible weekend. He started off in 7th and ended up in 15th. He had some struggles, and he got a 5-second penalty for going into the pit entrance across that line, which ruined part of his day. And then he got hit with some debris carrying around that was caused by Logan Sargent, which then ended up having more issues with that Aston Martin. And he started off strong, but really could not keep up in this race. I basically have that, he passed Perez on lap 40 for that 8th position, and then just kind of dropped off from there, and then ended up having to be in that back of that pack because he had to end up having to pit again, kind of out of sequence for that soft tires. That didn't really help out on that Aston Martin this weekend. Logan Sargent qualified 18th, ended up 14th, which is looking pretty good, but he was one of the first people to cause a virtual safety car, and then ended up turning into a safety car, which was kind of an odd situation anyway, but he ended up running wide on one of the corners and causing that front wing to break off. He was able to pull back up and drag that Williams back into the pits, dragging that front wing along with him, and that caused a lot of debris. And I think that was the main concern, was that they didn't know how much debris was on the track. But it was kind of odd that the FIA waited so long before they actually threw that safety car. And this was the first safety car, so that's when most of the field pitted for that one pit stop that they had. But they waited until he was actually pulling into the pit lane before they actually threw that full safety car. So in a sense, he crashed, he pulled back on the track, he dragged that front wing all the way around like half the track before they even threw that. So it was kind of weird when they threw that. The explanation I heard was they didn't actually get a good vibe of what debris was on the track, so they figured they had to throw the full safety car to be safe, so they could take a survey of what was on the track. But that allowed the whole field basically to then pit a little bit earlier than they were expecting to, but they could switch on that one-stop run. So most of the field switched from the mediums to that hards for that one stint. That pushed the Red Bull's up front, but then that was out of sync for what they were thinking for that second safety car, so that it caused the Red Bulls to not be able to handle what they would have liked to get farther up in the field. But Logan was able to come back and make it to 14th, so that's actually good, but it is kind of a bad situation for him in the sense that he's trying to fight for that seat in that Williams, and having that collision by himself, basically running off the track, is not the greatest look either. So we'll have to see how he comes out in the last several races to see if Williams is going to want to keep him around or try to get someone else in that seat. And that could be Liam Lawson, in the sense that depending on how the AlphaTauri's seats lay out, if Daniel keeps that seat in that AlphaTauri or not, that may put some pressure on him. So we'll have to see if Logan Sargent can keep his seat in that Williams. But even though he made up a few positions overall, and this was a tough race for him, he didn't really shine in this race, I guess, is what, at least in my view. So it's hard for him, but that's the lay of the land. Haas is coming in that 13th position with Nico Hülkenberg. They were started off really good, had great qualifying. He started off in 9th and ended up in 13th. But as usual, that Haas was just eating those tires up and wasn't able to really take advantage of those positions and hold everybody back. I mean, they did a little bit better, with his teammate K-Mag, getting him into the point range. But it seems like for that 9th and 6th positions that they started off with, they could have done a little bit better job in hopefully getting both of those Haas's into the points, but they were not able to. I think it's not necessarily Nico's fault. I think Hülkenberg did a pretty good job this weekend, just holding on to those positions as best he could in that Haas. So no distraction on Nico at all, but not where that Haas needs to be. Then we have Wan Yu Zhou, who qualified in 19th position and actually started in the pit lane into that last spot after he was having some issues, and made it all the way up to 12th. Now, this was very interesting for me because he started on the soft tires and then almost immediately, like on lap 3, switched over to some hard tires. So he switched to that alternate tire strategy that the Red Bulls were running, and was able to make pretty good rounds in that, in the sense that he switched back to the mediums and was able to pass Bottas, his teammate, and get that position and work his way up into that 12th position. So I think it was a really good weekend for Wan Yu Zhou. Right after he was confirmed to be signed back on that Alfa Romero, doing a really good job this weekend for him and that Alfa Romero. I'm not sure if he's the best driver for that Alfa, but he's having some struggling the last few races. But if he can keep this up, it'll prove me wrong. So then we come to Alex Albon, who qualified in 14th and ended up in 11th. He was having a okay race. He was not doing the greatest. He did lose a position on the start of the race. Started off on the mediums, switched to the hards on that lap 20 along with everybody else. Went to lap 44, then switched back to the mediums to try to run it out. He did run off on lap 13, caused a double yellow, which I think that was the end when actually Perez was kind of pushing him off a little bit when he was trying to get by, going back through the field. So that was hard for him, causing some of that issues with that Williams going to get shoved off. I think actually Perez got a 5-second penalty, if I'm not mistaken, for that incident, but it still didn't help Alex Albon get into those points like he was trying to keep into that line. I think it was still do a pretty good run in that Williams, even though this track is not the greatest for that Williams in the sense of that straightaways are good, but it was a lot of a braking, turn, sharp, put the power down, which that Williams is known for the straightaways, but not the greatest on the corners. So hopefully they can figure out how that Williams was going to work around the corners a little bit better for Japan next week. But generally over a pretty good job for Alex Albon, I think. This comes to Kevin Magnussen, who qualified in 6th and ended up in 10th. He did gain a point for Haas, which is really good to see. He was farther up in the field start off with, because he started off in that 6th position. Could not really maintain that position when those tires just started wearing off fairly quickly on that Haas, so he started dropping back. He did drop 2 positions on the start, so he didn't have the greatest start of the race. Fought, pretty hard with Max Verstappen and some other folks trying to keep into that position, and actually even got a black and white flag for driving off the track, people off the track of the race. So that kind of pushed him into more a defensive realm, I think. Wearing those tires out, ended up having to come in again. So he did a 2-stop race, was able to make it all the way back into that point position. So that was really good for the Haas to try to adapt, I guess, in that car to make him be able to get those points. So that's really good to see him giving it his all when he thought he was kind of out of the race to start off with after some of those issues that he was having. So it's good to see him up, and I think he did a really good job of pushing back up into those points, even though Haas really needs to do a lot of work on that to get those tires to maintain throughout the race, and those don't have that just the one lap wonders that they seem to have for the qualifying session to get them up in the front, but lose it during their whole race pace saga. So if they can get that worked out, I think they will be pretty good fighters in this mid pack. Right now they're kind of at the end of that pack, trying to get the points here and there when they can sneak out a point. Then we come to our nice Liam Lawson, our nice rookie, our 3 race rookie, who qualified in 10th and ended up getting in 9th, getting 2 points for AlphaTauri, which is awesome, boosting him up into the point realm for drivers. So we have a couple of drivers that don't have points yet, and he's able to pass those in the standing. So that's really good to see. He's given it all. I think he probably deserved the driver of the day if it wasn't for Carlos's strategic defense, I should say, of how he ended up maintaining that first position through the sheer will and determination of trying to come up with a strategy on his own, basically, and not relying on the Ferrari tacticians to dictate what he should do. So overall, I think Liam Lawson did an excellent job. He did qualify 10th, which is really good to see in this really difficult track to start off with. Maintain that even with some of the confusion that was going on, and getting points for the AlphaTauri. I would have liked to see exactly where he stood against Yuki Tsunoda during this race, but unfortunately Yuki was kind of knocked out on that first lap, so we didn't get to see that battle to see kind of where they stood against each other. So from what I can tell, Liam Lawson did an excellent job in that AlphaTauri, and I will give him credit where I think credit is due. Sergio Perez qualified 13th and ended up 8th. That Red Bull was not on point at all this weekend. Struggled in all 3 free practice sessions and in qualifying. So they ended up getting both Red Bulls knocked out in qualifying 2 session, so they didn't make it to qualify 3. So they were in the back of the pack, the mid of the pack for that qualifying segment. He did fight back to 8th, which is good to see, though he really struggled. I think in this circuit, he ended up having a lot of contact. As I said, he had contact with Yuki to start off with, and ended up having another contact with Alex Albon later in the race, just trying to put pressure and get those passes done. He was really struggling to get those done. I know both the Red Bulls started on hard tires, went long, and then switched to mediums. So that kind of gave some interesting dynamics to the rest of the field, where they start off a little bit slower, so they're getting passed at the beginning of the race, and then when they switched over to the mediums, then they were on fresh mediums, where everybody else was on a little bit older hards, and so they were starting to pass and started work their way back up through the field, which gave it some interesting moments in this race, even though it was a fairly dull race overall, as I said before. But doing a decent job, just not the great job that they need to have alongside Max, I think. So Sergio is a good driver. It's just not the great driver that they need, or they need to have the Red Bull more designed towards him, possibly, so that he can really shine in that Red Bull. So that's kind of where I fall on Sergio Perez. Oscar Piastri qualified 17th, so he didn't do a very good qualifying session. Did work his way up to 7th place. I know he did not have the updated McLaren specs, so it's hard to see where he actually fell between him and Lando Norris. But overall, I think he did a fairly good job working his way back into those points positions after being in the back of the field on this more processional style circuit. I did have him gain 3 spots at the very beginning of the race, which is good to see. He had a pretty good start, took advantage of the mistakes of people around him that gained those 3 positions, and then just slowly worked his way up into those point positions. So another good run for Oscar. I would have liked to see him exactly how he compared to Lando. I know those tires were running low at the end for both of them, so it would have been interesting to see if they were closer together. But a good run for Oscar Piastri. And we have another good run for Pierre Gasly, who qualified in 12th and ended up in 6th. He gained 1 position on the start and had a good fight with K-Mag early on in going for that 10th position. Worked his way up through the field, and really good to see that Pierre was doing all he could in that Alpine. It's kind of a shame that Ocon was able to not make it to the end because of that gearbox, because he was ahead of Pierre at one point. And it would have been interesting to see if Pierre could have maintained that pairing with Ocon as Ocon was moving through the field as well. But good race for Pierre Gasly. I just didn't see a whole lot of him because of the way the track was laid out, and the broadcasters were maintaining more of the front positions and the Red Bulls. So I didn't see exactly all what happened with Pierre Gasly, but moving up 6 positions, keeping in the points, was always good to see Pierre in that role. Gaining good points for Alpine as well. Max Verstappen qualified 11th and ended up 5th. I started thinking that he was going to make his way up onto the podium at one point, as he went long on those hard tires to start off with, and then switched to those mediums and was just passing people fairly easily, as that Red Bull seemed to like those medium tires a lot better than the hard tires. So he made it all the way to lap 41 before switching to those mediums, and then he had passed K-Mag on laps. Well, he passed K-Mag on laps 7 for the 8th position, and then he battled it out, switched to the tires, and then passed Oscar on lap 55 for 7th, and then passed Gasly on lap 58 for 6th. Worked his way up to 5th at the end. Really doing a good job. He could have probably made it a little bit higher end if they had switched out a little bit sooner, but they were hoping that they were going to get another safety car to help them in that mix to get that tire in place, which didn't happen quite on time where he was wanting to do that. So safety car came out just after they had swapped to that medium tire, which then caused a little bit of headache for those Red Bulls. Then you have Charles Leclerc, who qualified in 3rd and dropped down to 4th. You might think that he wasn't doing a very good job, but I think he was actually doing a really good job. He had a good start, got up to 2nd in that start of the race, maintained that 2nd position. He kind of had to fight against his team to keep in that 2nd position, because they wanted him to drop back 3 to 5 seconds behind his teammate to try to maintain the gap to keep everybody behind him. So he was actually acting more of the defensive person in this team, allowing Carlos Sainz to keep that 1st position and maintain the tires so that he could do that one stop without having issues. So he played the team game this weekend and it didn't hurt him too bad. He only dropped down to fourth, even though he was up to second for a while. They could have probably played, I don't remember if they had the tires, but they could have probably played with the Mercedes a little bit like they did when they pitted for those mediums for that last stop. Potentially he could have pitted and done some other battling with them. Instead, they kept him out to try to keep that gap so they have one more car for those Mercedes to have pass before they put pressure on Carlos. They really wanted a Ferrari win. So I think he did a good team game. It doesn't look that way when you look at the paper that he was doing a very good race, but I think he did a really good race overall considering what the team wanted him to do and where he ended up for this. So they played it safe and kept him out, made him do a little bit more defensive than he probably wanted to do, but ended up being still in that fourth position. So good points for Ferrari, which is always good to see. So we'll see if he can battle it out with Carlos next week in Japan, see if he can take that lead. I know there's some hints that we may have a better Ferrari, so hopefully we'll see that next week as well. Lewis Hamilton did an excellent job, I think, in qualifying fifth and then end up in third. I know they were able to maintain that extra set of mediums, fresh medium tires, and that helped them out in this instant, which gave us all this tension at the end of the race for that battle to see where those Mercedes were actually going to be able to, maintain and pull ahead, see if they're going to get to that second or even to that top tier position between him and George. Unfortunately, George wasn't able to maintain either his concentration or something, and that caused him to crash out, which then didn't give Lewis the extra room at that point in time in the field to actually put pressure on Lando. So he ended up in third. But overall, I think Lewis did a really good job. Was actually faster than George was at the end of the race, as you can see with the fastest lap. Did an excellent job of keeping that Mercedes in the running all throughout this race. So a really good race for him. Lando qualified in fourth and ended up in second. He had an awesome race. Keeping that second position was very tough. He didn't have the greatest start, losing one position. And then Lewis Hamilton kind of passed him and his teammate for that second position that he ended up having to give positions back, which caused some headache at the very beginning of the race, but it was able to get there, and with those pit stop strategy that the Mercedes jumped back in, he got up to that second position, and with a little bit of help from Carlos, was able to maintain that second position with that DRS timing to try to help fight off those Mercedes at the end of the race, which caused a beautiful race to the end of this stint, which was really good to see. Really, kept you on the edge of your seat. But he did an excellent job of keeping that McLaren in the race, even with the tires. He said he even hit the wall where George Russell just probably hit it a little bit harder and kind of slammed into the side lost his traction whereas Lando just tapped that side, was able to maintain control over that McLaren. So he was on the very edge near this end of this race as well, mentally and probably through those tire degradation. So I think Lando did an awesome job in this race, just keeping in his head in the game, keeping where that he could, pushing that McLaren as hard as he could, getting everything out of that McLaren. And then Carlos Sainz, starting off first, he had a great start of the race, kept the lead, was able to, keep the lead again on the restart for the safety car and keep that front running position, even with that pit stop strategy that Red Bull was kind of in the mix. He never lost the lead of the race. maintained that pace, really controlled his tires, controlled the whole race generally. I mean, you could see the Mercedes coming back through the field, and he was the one that basically was saying, to his team, yes, I'm dropping back to get Lando into this DRS zones so that he could be faster on the straightaways, which makes it harder for the Mercedes to pass on those DRS zones, which would hopefully keep, Sainz in place, because he knew he could keep ahead of the McLaren, but with the Mercedes on the new tires, it would have been a little bit tougher to do that. And so he was playing more of the strategic game himself over what his team was actually telling him over the radio. So I think Carlos did everything he could, even though it wasn't the best race for him in the sense of like just going full flat out. It was all about maintaining those tires in both the first stint and the second stint of this race. So it wasn't quite going all out on this qualifying speeds, but keeping everything he could to win the race. And so that was really good to see from Carlos. So as you can see here, he was voted the driver of the day, and I kind of agree with that. But if I had to vote for somebody else, it probably would have been Liam Lawson, who at the qualifying, jumping into those point positions on his third race is awesome to see, where Lewis Hamilton got the fastest lap, so he got that extra point for this Grand Prix. So overall, I think they did a really good job, even though the general race was a procession. It gave us some interesting moments with Red Bull, either dropping behind or pulling ahead, depending on their tire strategy at that point in time. And then with the Mercedes really pushing at the end on those new mediums, I think livened up the whole race significantly. And that's why most people seem to rate this as a high, exciting race that they really liked. This leads us to the constructors standings. So we see that Liam Lawson getting those 2 points jumps ahead of Logan Sargent, who now we have 3 drivers that have 0 points, with Daniel Ricciardo, Nick DeVries, and Logan Sargent. And with our newcomer, Liam Lawson, getting that 2 points, put him into that 19th position. Kevin Magnussen got a point, tying him now with Yuki, but he stays in that same position. And then you get to basically the front of the field, where we have Fernando dropping back to 4th, where Lewis Hamilton jumps up to 3rd with 10 points over him due to this race. Of course, you have Max Verstappen with a outstanding lead with 374 points over the rest. So it'll probably just be a couple more races before he is crowned champion for this season, for the year. Then we have the constructors standing. So we have Red Bull keeping that lead with 597 points, way ahead of Mercedes at 289, with Ferrari making up some ground a little bit with 265 this race. Aston Martin didn't get any points, and you have McLaren starting to pull ahead of Alpine a little bit more, but not really in a threat range with Aston Martin as of yet. So generally, we have the same constructors standings as we had before. I will have to have several more of those before we see any kind of changes and jumps here and there, unless we have one of the back runners jump up and get points, or heavy points. And then we have our next week, we have Japan, the Suzuka race, which has a length of 3.608 miles. We're going to have a 53-lap race for a total distance of 191.054 miles, with a lap record of 1 minute 30 seconds, 0.983. That was done by Lewis Hamilton in 2019, and it was first introduced in 1987. I love this race. It's probably my favorite circuit, even though I end up going to Circuit of America, which is closer by. So I love that track as well and the layout of that track. But this is probably my favorite more historic race that I've seen, and I will love to see how these new vehicles can maintain this pace and this technical track on these corners and overpass. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and hopefully you'll like this video and subscribe if you want to see what my reactions for the Suzuka race are. Until then, see you later.